Well, that is exactly the problem. I was talking about it with my wife yesterday as we looked around and walked into the square here, which I can remember so vividly from Mr. Ripley, because Anthony was a very close friend of mine. It's terribly difficult to avoid cliche, frankly, particularly when, it's particularly difficult, I think, in a subject like Corelli, where the beauty of the place is part of the subject matter of the story. Ripley, it's a little easier because you can throw away the background, and it's a context for a very powerful narrative which has quite other things in mind than the specific sense of place. Corelli is about the Italian celebration of, you know, where they are and what's going on and so forth. So it's a trickier thing to avoid. And you know, you shoot things to make them look and feel right and to have the right atmosphere, and of course you lay yourself wide open to the fact that it looks like a kind of tourist travelogue, which is an unfair way to describe John Toll's work in the film, but it certainly came up from time to time. You know, he's an amazing cinematographer who did an amazing job with it. But it's tough. It's tough. Well, yes, it's the history of the project is absolutely true, because the project was then with Paramount, I think, and when it foundered on famously their inability to find or cast an actor to play Shakespeare, because Julia Roberts was in place to play. She wasn't called Viola then, she was called Belinda in that version of the story. It's because it was 6 years later, there was no way that Julia Roberts was going to be involved with it again. I think it's a very particular thing that happens, which is summed up in the phrase, the ship sailed. You know, when you've been involved with a project and you struggle with it to get it made and to get it to where you need it to go, which is a process that's involved in almost every film you make. If the ship sails at that point, it's somehow difficult to go back. You feel as if the auspices are not quite right for it. Were any of those people talked about again? Not really. Winona was, I don't think Winona was involved in the first version. She'd have been much too young. Or considered for the first version. There was a possibility at one point that she might be considered for it, but it didn't really come to anything. My first choice for the part had always been Gwyneth, because I had auditioned her for another project before which the studio wouldn't allow me to cast her in. I knew of her and thought she was outstanding, and I also, obviously, she had a relationship with Miramax and had done a period British part, so I knew she could handle the accent. But at that point, she was not interested in it. I think she'd passed on the film at an earlier point when another director was involved in it, because I think there were a huge number of directors who were involved in it before it landed in my lucky lap. So she was the first person that I wanted, and the search for Shakespeare was a long one. I went, as I've on record as saying, I went past Joe Fiennes, who I knew, that I hadn't worked with the first time. We did an audition and it was not quite right, I didn't think. And then when we went through and there were certain people at Miramax who were very anxious for me to consider, and a lot of people backed away just on the basis of playing such an iconic figure. And eventually the casting director and I kept looking through our lists and saying, you know, I think I should do some work with Joe, and because he's so right for it in so many ways. And I had some new material that Tom and I had worked on, Tom Stoppard and I, and scenes that he'd never read or seen because they weren't in the script when he originally auditioned. And we did a day's work together, and as the day wore on, I thought, I found the guy. He's absolutely brilliant, and so he proved to be.
When the film finally hit cinema screens, it was obviously a smash hit, and you took home the Best Picture Oscar for the movie. How did it change your life, and indeed your lifestyle?
Well, lifestyle, it certainly changes your life. I mean, because it happened relatively late in my career, you have perhaps a steadier head on your shoulders than you might do if it happened in your 20s. I think it could be massively disorienting because everything gets thrown at you, and the sort of fairy dust that attaches to something that's had that degree of acclaim can blind you, because people just want a piece of that. They want to be associated with something that has had that effect, and you're the nearest thing at hand. And it happens to actors as well, but it means that it's very disorienting because you unless you know exactly where you want to go the next time around. Obviously the bar is raised so much higher in terms of expectation. You're bombarded with so many possibilities. I'm talking about in terms of professional issues, career and so forth. You get to meet wonderful people, very interesting people that perhaps you wouldn't otherwise do. You get invited to lovely festivals like this. But apart from that, and I suppose it just gets a little bit more difficult to manage your life, just because I'd like to be doing theatre as well, but that gets a little bit more difficult when you are, you know, juggling projects whose dates are moving around because of the actors that are involved and the availability of those actors and so forth. That gets a little harder to manage, but I'm not complaining. I started out in radio, and I worked in the script department at BBC Radio after running a theatre company at Cambridge, and in that capacity I got an invitation to go to help set up a script department for a nascent radio drama project, publicly funded radio drama project, part of National Public Radio in America. And that network is associated, as is public television, with the university network in America. So all the stations all over the country are housed and associated, attached to the university establishment. And I was developing